In the late 1930s, few could have imagined that a rugged, foul-mouthed boat builder from Louisiana would one day alter the course of global warfare. His name was Andrew Jackson Higgins, a man who knew the water like others knew the land. In an age when generals and admirals planned wars from offices and map rooms, Higgins built his empire knee-deep in the bayous, where wood met water, and where every design was tested not by theory, but by survival. Before the war began, Higgins was already a legend along the Gulf Coast. His company, Higgins Industries, produced fast, shallow draft boats capable of navigating the treacherous swamps and river deltas of Louisiana. They were designed for loggers, oilmen, and trappers, but their true genius lay in their versatility. They could move through mud flats, over sandbars, and across the shallows where ordinary vessels ran aground. Higgins had built them tough because the bayou demanded it. In these years, the United States military was still caught in the doctrines of the past. The Navy's Bureau of Ships relied on slow, cumbersome landing craft designs that were better suited to calm harbors than contested beaches. But war was coming, and it would not be fought in harbors. By 1937, war in Asia was already showing what the future of amphibious warfare would look like. Japanese troops had landed in Shanghai using small boats with a revolutionary feature: a bow ramp that dropped open, allowing soldiers to run directly onto shore. To the Marines who witnessed this, it was a revelation. But within the U.S. military hierarchy, innovation moved slowly, and skepticism was the default. Higgins, however, was not bound by military bureaucracy. When Marine officers came to New Orleans seeking a boat that could run aground, discharge men and cargo, and back off under its own power, Higgins showed them his Eureka boat, a tough, flat-bottomed craft built for the Louisiana swamps. It could climb over logs, rocks, and sandbars with ease. The Marines were impressed, but they needed one more modification: a ramp at the bow. The idea was straightforward but radical. Traditional naval engineers thought such a ramp would weaken the hull and compromise seaworthiness. But Higgins disagreed. He returned to his workshop and, through countless nights of trial and error, redesigned his boat to include a steel bow ramp. By 1940, his creation was complete: a small wooden vessel that could storm beaches, deliver men and vehicles directly into battle, and retreat before enemy fire could destroy it. The landing craft, vehicle, personnel, LCVP, was born. Soldiers would come to know it by another name: the Higgins boat. In 1941, as America inched toward war, the military placed its first orders. By the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Higgins Industries was already building hundreds of boats a month. When war was declared, his small operation exploded into one of the most important industrial enterprises in the United States. At a time when most factories struggled to keep pace with wartime production demands, Higgins Industries grew exponentially. In 1938, he had 75 employees. By 1943, that number had surged to more than 25,000, spread across 7 plants in New Orleans. His operation ran day and night, workers, men and women alike, producing fleets of boats that would one day define amphibious warfare. What made Higgins different wasn't just his design, it was his leadership. He broke every rule of corporate America. He cursed, he yelled, he smoked, he fought with everyone: the Navy, his competitors, even his own engineers. Yet beneath the rough surface was an uncompromising dedication to efficiency, equality, and results. His factories were among the first in the South to be racially integrated. Black and white workers labored side by side, earning equal pay for equal work. In an era of segregation, that was revolutionary. President Franklin D. Roosevelt took notice. In 1942, during a secret inspection tour of U.S. war industries, Roosevelt visited Higgins' plant in New Orleans. He saw the factory floors alive with energy, men and women hammering, riveting, painting, assembling, boats taking shape by the hundreds. The president was impressed, not just by the scale, but by the spirit. Higgins, never shy, told Roosevelt exactly what he thought the Navy needed, and why bureaucrats were slowing victory. Roosevelt reportedly left the plant muttering to his aides, "If only I had 10 more Higginses." But the Navy's Bureau of Ships didn't share Roosevelt's admiration. The engineers despised Higgins' brashness. He was a civilian who had proven them wrong. He had designed a better landing craft than their decades of studies and committees could produce. The tension between Higgins and the Navy became legendary, a battle of wills between bureaucratic order and raw ingenuity. And time after time, Higgins won. The true test came in 1942, when American forces prepared for their first major amphibious operation of the war, Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. Thousands of troops had to land on beaches defended by Axis forces. The Navy needed boats, hundreds of them, capable of landing soldiers, tanks, and supplies directly on shore. Higgins delivered. His factories worked around the clock, producing LCVPs faster than anyone thought possible. When the landings took place, the results spoke for themselves. The boats performed flawlessly. The flat-bottom design allowed them to glide over reefs and sandbars that would have stopped deeper draft vessels. The steel ramp dropped open, and men charged directly into battle. Then, in reverse, the boats backed off, took on more troops, and returned again, an endless cycle of courage and efficiency. Military commanders quickly realized what Higgins had given them: the power to invade anywhere. The success of the North African landings led to even greater demands. By 1943, American and Allied planners were preparing for invasions in Sicily, Italy, and eventually France. Each operation required more boats than the last. By the time of D-Day, more than 1,500 Higgins boats would land troops along the Normandy coast. Every beachhead, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, echoed with the sound of their engines and the thud of their ramps hitting sand. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, would later say, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." That was no exaggeration. The entire Allied war plan, from the beaches of Normandy to the island chains of the Pacific, depended on the ability to land men and equipment directly from sea to shore. And only Higgins' boat could do it at the scale required. The genius of the design lay in its simplicity. Constructed primarily from plywood, the LCVP was light, fast, and cheap to produce. It could carry a platoon of 36 soldiers, or a jeep and a small squad. Its shallow draft allowed it to approach beaches others could not, while its ramp enabled rapid deployment under fire. The propeller was protected by a tunnel hull, allowing the boat to run aground without damage, and then reverse back into the surf. Higgins had built it to survive the swamps of Louisiana. It turned out to be perfect for the beaches of Normandy and the coral reefs of the Pacific. As 1943 turned to 1944, Higgins Industries became the heart of American amphibious power. From New Orleans, trains carried freshly built boats to ports across the country, where they were shipped to battlefronts around the world. Soldiers and Marines would remember the smell of oil and salt, the creaking wood, the roar of engines, and the drop of the ramp that signaled the moment between life and death. To the men who fought, the boat was more than a machine, it was their bridge to battle. When they saw one approaching, they didn't say, "LCVP." They said, "Here comes a Higgins boat." As the war expanded, so did the reach of Higgins' creation. Across the vast Pacific, the Higgins boat became both the spearhead and the lifeline of America's island-hopping campaign. Every mile gained toward Japan had to be fought, beach by beach. There were no ports, no docks, only coral reefs, volcanic sand, and entrenched defenders waiting with machine guns and mortars. The Marines learned quickly that without a dependable landing craft, there could be no victory. At Tarawa in November 1943, the Pacific War revealed its true brutality. Thousands of Marines attempted to land under heavy fire from fortified Japanese positions. The first waves came in Higgins boats, churning toward the beaches through the shallow lagoon. Many hit the coral reefs and became stranded under withering fire. Yet even as shells exploded around them, the boats kept coming, wave after wave, until enough Marines had reached the shore to establish a foothold. The price was staggering: over 1,000 Americans dead, and 2,000 wounded in just 76 hours of combat. But the lessons of Tarawa would shape every amphibious assault that followed. Higgins' boats had proven their value, but the conditions demanded more. Engineers reinforced hulls, refined propeller tunnels, and strengthened ramps. Within months, new designs poured out of New Orleans and Allied factories across the country. The boats evolved as fast as the war itself. When the Allies landed at Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the pattern repeated. The first thing to appear on the horizon was not a battleship or aircraft carrier, but lines of Higgins boats heading toward the beaches, each packed with men who understood that their survival depended on the reliability of those wooden hulls. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, where nearly 7,000 Americans died taking an 8-square-mile island, Higgins boats delivered 30,000 Marines in the first assault waves. Their ramps dropped onto black volcanic sand, and the men surged forward into some of the fiercest combat of the Pacific War. 2 months later, at Okinawa, the final great amphibious assault of World War II, the scale was unprecedented. On the first day alone, 60,000 troops came ashore in Higgins boats, under fire from one of the largest concentrations of Japanese artillery ever assembled. Behind them, more waves followed, reinforcements, supplies, vehicles, all carried by the same humble wooden craft that had begun its life in the Louisiana swamps. The Higgins boat didn't just serve in the Pacific. In Europe, they ferried troops across rivers under fire. During the Rhine crossings in March 1945, Higgins boats carried American forces across into Germany, braving machine gun nests and artillery in scenes that mirrored their earlier landings on distant beaches. By the time the war ended, the numbers were staggering. Higgins Industries and its licensees had produced over 23,000 LCVPs, and when added to the PT boats, LCMs, and other craft designed under Higgins' supervision, the total exceeded 20,000 vessels built directly by his company. Nearly every Allied amphibious operation, from North Africa to Normandy, Sicily to Saipan, depended on Higgins boats. They had landed more troops on hostile shores than all other methods combined. Higgins' name became synonymous with amphibious warfare. Soldiers didn't say they were landing in a landing craft. They said simply, "We're going ashore in a Higgins boat." As production peaked in 1943 and 1944, Higgins Industries represented not just innovation but transformation. His factories became a model of wartime efficiency, a chaotic, roaring, 24-hour world where welders, carpenters, and mechanics worked shoulder to shoulder. The atmosphere was electric, fueled by patriotism, urgency, and Higgins' relentless personality. The man himself became a national figure. In August 1943, Life magazine ran a feature on Higgins and his operations, describing in detail his unconventional management style, his volcanic temper, his endless drive, his willingness to ignore every tradition that slowed progress. Higgins had no patience for red tape. When a Navy official told him something couldn't be done, he would bark back, "Watch me do it." He had a gift for cutting through bureaucracy with the same precision his boats cut through water. When President Roosevelt visited his plant on September 29, 1942, even the commander-in-chief seemed caught off guard by Higgins' intensity. Sitting beside Roosevelt in a convertible as they toured the factory floor, Higgins explained his designs with the confidence of a man who knew his worth. Roosevelt left deeply impressed. The photographs from that visit, later released to the public, made Higgins' face recognizable nationwide. Yet his relationship with the Navy remained stormy. The Bureau of Ships despised that a civilian outsider had outperformed their engineers. Higgins had proven, beyond question, that practical experience and ingenuity could accomplish more than decades of theoretical design. The resentment never faded. Despite his clashes with authority, Higgins maintained unwavering loyalty to his workers. He paid well, promoted based on merit, and ran one of the most integrated industrial workforces in the country. At a time when segregation was the law of the South, black and white employees at Higgins Industries worked side by side, earning equal wages and respect, a quiet but profound act of social defiance. He also fought bitterly against unions, seeing them as an obstacle between himself and his workforce. He considered unionization an unnecessary interference that slowed production during wartime. The disputes led to strikes, legal battles, and growing tension, conflicts that would later contribute to the company's post-war collapse. Still, during the war, his leadership inspired fierce loyalty. To his workers, he was both tyrant and hero, a man who demanded the impossible and somehow achieved it. By the war's end in August 1945, Higgins' factories had delivered the tools of victory. Yet, as the guns fell silent, the future of his empire grew uncertain. His entire operation had been built for one purpose: to win a global war. When peace came, that purpose vanished overnight. When the war finally ended, Andrew Higgins expected gratitude, maybe even a permanent place in America's post-war military industry. Instead, he found himself quietly pushed aside. The same Navy officials who had once needed him now regarded him as a nuisance, a loud, uncontrollable civilian who had dared to challenge their authority and win. Wartime necessity had made Higgins indispensable. But in peacetime, he was expendable. Higgins' factories, once roaring with life, began to fall silent. Government contracts dried up almost overnight. By late 1945, production lines that had built thousands of landing craft were idle. Skilled men and women who had labored day and night for victory were laid off in waves. The transformation was brutal. From a peak of over 25,000 employees, Higgins Industries shrank to a few hundred. The same massive workshops that had once built the backbone of Allied invasion forces now stood empty, echoing with the ghosts of wartime urgency. Higgins tried to adapt. He launched peacetime projects, small boats, commercial barges, even experimental aircraft. But none could match the scale or the necessity of war production. America had moved on. The military bureaucracy he had fought against for years now worked against him. Contracts were given to politically connected corporations like General Motors and Boeing, not to a volatile boat builder from New Orleans who had made too many enemies in Washington. Higgins' health began to decline under the strain. Years of relentless pressure, long hours, and constant conflict had taken their toll. But he refused to slow down. He saw himself as a patriot abandoned by the very system he had helped to save. He once told a journalist, "The Navy couldn't design a boat that would float, so they took mine. Now they can't stand that it worked." It wasn't bitterness, it was heartbreak disguised as defiance. Higgins' public image also began to fade. The spotlight that had once made him a wartime hero now turned elsewhere, to the generals, admirals, and presidents who symbolized victory. The man who had built the very craft that carried soldiers into battle was barely mentioned in post-war celebrations. But among those soldiers, the ones who had stormed Normandy, crossed the Rhine, or fought their way ashore at Iwo Jima, the name Higgins still carried reverence. To them, he wasn't a forgotten contractor. He was the man who had given them a fighting chance to survive. In 1947, Higgins Industries was officially dissolved. The factories were sold off or dismantled. The once mighty industrial complex that had built the Higgins boats, those wooden ramped vessels that had changed the course of history, was gone. Andrew Higgins died in 1952, at the age of 65. His funeral in New Orleans was modest. Few government officials attended. But among those who did were veterans, men who had ridden his boats through enemy fire and owed their lives to his impossible invention. They knew, even if the public did not, that the war could not have been won without him. Years later, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who had commanded the Allied invasion of Europe, would make a statement that finally restored Higgins' name to its rightful place in history. Eisenhower said, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different, and possibly impossible." It was one of the most powerful acknowledgments ever given to an American civilian. In that single sentence, Eisenhower confirmed what many veterans had always known, that the Higgins boat was not just a machine of war, but the foundation upon which Allied victory was built. From the swamps of Louisiana to the beaches of Normandy, the invention of one man had reshaped the course of world history. The Higgins boat, the LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, was a masterpiece of simplicity. Its plywood hull, flat bottom, and retractable ramp turned any coastline into a landing zone. It required no port, no dock, no infrastructure, only courage. Its genius lay in its practicality. It could carry a platoon of 36 fully armed soldiers, a jeep, or 8,000 pounds of cargo. It drew only 3 feet of water, allowing it to run aground directly on shore. The bow ramp, lowered by 2 cables, allowed men to rush straight onto the beach, a design element that made amphibious warfare possible on a global scale. Every great amphibious assault, from Guadalcanal to Normandy, from Tarawa to Okinawa, relied on Higgins' design. Without it, Allied strategy would have been paralyzed. The D-Day invasion alone required more than 4,000 Higgins boats, forming the backbone of Operation Overlord. Every soldier who ran down a Higgins ramp onto Omaha or Utah Beach became part of a living tribute to Andrew Higgins' vision. But beyond its tactical brilliance, the story of the Higgins boat is also the story of American ingenuity, how one stubborn, unconventional mind could defy bureaucracy, challenge the status quo, and reshape modern warfare. Higgins didn't just build boats. He built a system, a model of rapid production, decentralized design, and workforce unity that prefigured the later boom of American manufacturing power. His factories produced at a pace that stunned Washington. In 1943 alone, his plants launched an average of 700 craft per month. He once quipped that he could build a new boat faster than the Navy could approve a drawing. That attitude made him a hero to his workers, and a nightmare to the bureaucrats who feared him. He was profane, fiery, and fearless. He had little respect for rank or uniform. But when the war came, he delivered results no one else could match. Higgins once described his company's wartime mission with perfect simplicity. "We're building boats to win this war. Everything else can wait." And so they did, with unmatched speed, efficiency, and resolve. In total, over 23,358 Higgins boats were produced during World War II. Combined with the other craft his company designed, patrol boats, supply vessels, and landing craft for tanks, his total contribution exceeded 20,000 additional units. Those numbers alone would be enough to secure his legacy. But what truly defined Higgins was not his production output, it was his spirit. He represented the quintessential American inventor, flawed, relentless, visionary. A man who could see what others dismissed as impossible, and make it real. Though Andrew Higgins never lived to see his full legacy restored, history, as it often does, eventually corrected itself. In the decades following World War II, military historians began to look beyond the famous generals and battlefields. They began asking a quieter, but equally profound question: how did the Allies actually reach those beaches? The answer led them back to New Orleans. By the 1960s, surviving Higgins boats had become rare relics. Most had been destroyed after the war, their plywood hulls burned, abandoned, or simply left to rot in forgotten harbors. But a few remained, weathered and scarred, silent witnesses to the greatest amphibious invasion in history. Veterans who had stormed the beaches of Normandy began speaking publicly about their experiences. They described the terror of those first waves, and the moment the Higgins ramp dropped. They remembered the spray of seawater, the crack of German gunfire, the shout of officers urging them forward. And they remembered the boat. Many said that when they thought of D-Day, they didn't picture the generals or the maps. They pictured the Higgins ramp, the wooden gate between life and death, and the man who had built it. As those stories spread, Higgins' name began to reappear in military archives and museums. In 1964, the U.S. government formally recognized his contribution with a commemorative plaque at the National World War II Museum, fittingly located in his hometown of New Orleans. But even that recognition did not fully capture what he had accomplished. Because Higgins didn't just create a tool of war, he created a new way of thinking about war itself. Before his design, amphibious assaults were considered impractical, even suicidal. Naval officers believed landing on an open beach without a port was impossible. The British experience at Gallipoli in World War I had left a bitter legacy, a warning against coastal invasions. Higgins ignored all of it. He understood that warfare was evolving, that speed, surprise, and mobility would matter more than heavy fortifications. His landing craft gave commanders something they never had before: flexibility. It turned the ocean from a barrier into a highway. Eisenhower's staff later noted that without Higgins' boats, the Allies might have needed 2 more years to plan a viable invasion strategy for France, if they could have planned one at all. In essence, the Higgins boat made the entire concept of D-Day possible. As the Cold War began, military strategists quietly studied the lessons of amphibious warfare that Higgins had pioneered. The United States Marine Corps, in particular, adapted his principles into their own doctrine of rapid deployment, combining ships, landing craft, and helicopters into what would become known as amphibious task forces. Every modern landing ship, every beachhead assault vehicle, every concept of force projection over water, all traced their roots to Higgins' plywood craft. The U.S. Navy's later landing craft air cushion, LCAC, and modern amphibious transport docks owe as much to his design philosophy as to their engineers. It was Higgins' belief that war demanded speed, simplicity, and adaptability, principles that remain central to modern military logistics. But perhaps the most remarkable part of his legacy lies not in the technology, but in the people who built it. During the height of production, Higgins Industries became one of the most racially and socially integrated companies in America. At a time when segregation was still the law in much of the South, Higgins ignored those restrictions. He hired black workers, women, and immigrants in large numbers, not out of ideology, but out of necessity and fairness. He cared only about competence and commitment. One of his foremen later said, "If you could drive a nail straight, you had a job at Higgins." This workforce built not only boats, but a vision of America's industrial future, one in which cooperation, rather than prejudice, drove success. The result was a culture of unity that mirrored the war effort itself, Americans of every background working side by side to achieve something greater than themselves. When the National World War II Museum opened its doors in 2000 in New Orleans, it was no coincidence that its founding focus was amphibious warfare and the Higgins boat. In the museum's main hall, visitors can see a fully restored LCVP, its ramp lowered, its interior lined with worn wooden planks. Standing before it, one can almost hear the echoes of the past: boots splashing into surf, shouted commands, the roar of gunfire in the distance. It remains one of the museum's most powerful exhibits, not because of its size, but because of what it represents. That unassuming wooden craft, flat-bottomed, awkward, even crude by modern standards, embodied the courage of a generation. It was the vessel that carried ordinary men into extraordinary moments. And behind it all was Andrew Higgins, the self-taught shipbuilder from the Louisiana bayous who defied the odds, outthought the bureaucracy, and built the bridge to victory. In 2019, one of the few remaining original Higgins boats was meticulously restored and launched again into Lake Pontchartrain, not as a weapon, but as a tribute. As the craft touched water for the first time in decades, spectators cheered. Many were descendants of the men who had built or ridden in them. It was a reminder that history, though sometimes slow to remember, never truly forgets. Andrew Higgins' story is ultimately the story of American possibility, a story of what happens when individual vision meets national purpose. He was not a general, not a politician, not a man of power or privilege. He was a builder, a problem solver. And yet, when the world needed him most, his idea, born of Louisiana swampland and stubborn ingenuity, became the weapon that turned the tide of war. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, from the frozen shores of the Aleutians to the deserts of North Africa, Higgins' boats carried freedom forward, one wave at a time. When Andrew Higgins died in 1952, there were no parades, no public tributes, no national headlines. The war was over, and America had moved on. Jet aircraft ruled the skies, Nuclear strategy defined new fears, and the humble wooden landing craft seemed a relic of a simpler age. But in truth, Higgins' influence never faded, it simply became part of the very fabric of modern military history. Every amphibious operation since World War II, from Korea's Incheon landing to the evacuation of Saigon and humanitarian missions around the world, carried his design's DNA. The essential concept of a flat-bottomed craft with a front-loading ramp remains the standard for every military in the world. Even in today's digital age of drones and precision warfare, the idea of getting men and machines safely from ship to shore, the most basic and dangerous part of war, still depends on principles Higgins perfected with wood, nails, and imagination. It's easy to forget how radical that idea once was. Before Higgins, naval planners were prisoners of deep water ports. Armies could not land where they wished, they had to fight for harbors. But Higgins turned every coastline into a potential gateway. His invention changed not just how the Allies fought, but how they thought. Generals who had once drawn arrows on maps now had to think in tides, surf, and sandbars. Logistics officers planned around the capacities of Higgins' boats, not the limitations of geography. And soldiers, from the Marines in the Pacific to the GIs of Normandy, trusted those boats with their lives. To them, the Higgins boat was more than a craft, it was a lifeline. The story of D-Day, the largest amphibious assault in history, cannot be told without the Higgins boat. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as thousands of ships lay off the coast of Normandy, 23,000 Higgins boats began their runs toward the beaches. Each one carried about 36 men, cramped, wet, terrified, but ready. When the ramps dropped, the war changed forever. Photographs of those moments, men leaping into waist-deep surf, explosions churning the water, the flat-nosed boats behind them, became the defining images of the 20th century. Eisenhower later said, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we could never have landed over an open beach." That statement, coming from the Supreme Allied Commander, was no exaggeration. Without Higgins' boats, the Allied invasion would have required established ports. The Germans knew this and fortified every harbor from Calais to Cherbourg. The element of surprise, the key to D-Day's success, would have been impossible. Higgins' design made any beach a landing zone. And because of that, the Germans were forced to defend everywhere, stretching their lines thin, confusing their intelligence, and ensuring that when the real blow came, they were unprepared. Yet Higgins' genius wasn't only technical, it was human. He believed in his workers, and his workers believed in him. His factories ran like ecosystems, not just production lines, but communities. Black and white, men and women, native-born and immigrant, they stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by purpose. The Army inspectors who visited Higgins Industries often remarked on the energy of the place. Unlike the sterile efficiency of northern assembly plants, Higgins shipyards vibrated with a sense of ownership. Every rivet, every plank, every drop of paint carried pride. Higgins himself often walked the shop floors, speaking with welders and carpenters, asking for their opinions, solving problems in real time. He understood that morale built machines as much as steel and wood did. That spirit was contagious. During the height of production, Higgins Industries turned out a new boat every 23 minutes, an almost unbelievable pace made possible by teamwork and relentless drive. After the war, as demand evaporated, the company shrank. Contracts disappeared. Workers returned to civilian life. Higgins tried to adapt, building pleasure boats and experimenting with new designs, but the world had moved on. Still, the veterans remembered. They wrote letters, told stories, and passed on memories to their families. Many said that the name, Higgins, was the last word they heard before battle, shouted by officers as they clambered down into the boats that would carry them into history. In those letters, a quiet gratitude persisted. They remembered the roar of the engines, the slap of waves against plywood, the sudden crash of the ramp hitting the sand, and the knowledge that somewhere, a man in New Orleans had given them a fighting chance. Today, that legacy endures not only in museums but in every soldier who studies amphibious warfare. The National World War II Museum keeps a working replica of the Higgins boat as its centerpiece, not behind glass, but open to walk inside. Visitors step onto the deck, feel the rough wood beneath their feet, and imagine what it must have been like to ride toward enemy fire. It is a visceral reminder that history isn't written only by those who give orders, but by those who build the means to carry them out. Andrew Higgins was one of those rare figures whose contribution defied rank or convention. He didn't just support the war, he enabled it. His invention reshaped the very concept of invasion, logistics, and mobility. He took a simple idea, a ramp that dropped from the bow, and turned it into the bridge between sea and land, between strategy and sacrifice, between survival and victory. When you stand before a Higgins boat today, scarred, faded, the paint peeling, it's hard not to feel the weight of what it represents. It's more than wood and steel. It's a vessel that carried the hopes of an entire generation. It reminds us that innovation doesn't always come from institutions or from those with titles, but from those who see a problem differently, and have the courage to solve it, even when others call them mad. Andrew Higgins was called many things: reckless, stubborn, even insane. But history proved him right. His plywood ramp became the door through which the free world entered occupied Europe. And on that cold June morning in 1944, when the first wave of soldiers surged onto the beaches of Normandy, every man who stepped onto the sand did so across the invention of a man who refused to accept that something couldn't be done. Eisenhower's war was won not only by generals, tanks, and aircraft, but by a craftsman's mind, a builder's hands, and a wooden ramp that changed the course of history. Andrew Higgins never led troops in battle. But in a very real sense, he led them ashore, and helped lead the world back to freedom. That is his legacy. That is how one boat builder's insane plywood ramp won Eisenhower's war.